As you might have heard, is Deacon Dance Farrell. And every time I say that, I'm asked the same question. Why did your mother name you Dance? It's a silly name. Was your mother a hippie? And it's at this point that I have to mention a promise that I made to my mother. I promised her that I would never blame her for what I did to myself. You see, when I was a young man, a teenager, about 19 years old, I decided to change my name to Dance. My name was Matt before. And I did this because of an experience I had. In my youth, I have to admit I was not the best young man you've ever met. I was close to being a drug addict. And I had a terrible experience. I lost one of my dear friends to methamphetamines. And after having this experience, it broke my heart so deeply and so profoundly that I ended up walking out of my house and I walked off into the woods and I went camping for a very long time. It was my way of finding some healing in that moment. But eventually I got lonely because you can't stay out in the woods forever. And so I came back, and as I was coming back, it was late. And I looked out over the city of Sonora where I was living. And all the lights were shining and the cars were going up and down the hills. And I had this sudden sense that I just didn't belong there. And I turned around in the woods and I realized I didn't belong there either. I know it's shocking, a teenager feeling like they don't belong. I've never heard that before. But as I stood there in that moment, I in my profound wisdom at 19, I suddenly felt that I never would belong anywhere. That I would always be dancing the line in between places. Often people think that my name, I changed it because I really liked dancing. Well, I don't mind it, that's for sure. But the reason I changed my name was from a fundamental sense of not belonging. And as a young man, I didn't really know what that meant, but I knew the feeling. And now, I find that name more appropriate than it's ever been before. Because now I know that you and I are called to live in the world, but to not be of it. That somehow you, like me, are called to dance the line in between. That we're supposed to somehow be in both places at once. As I try to express this feeling to you, there's one name that comes to me that shows this reality more than any other in our modern age. His name was Pope John Paul II. Dare I say, the Great. I'd like to read you a short excerpt from a book written by Jason Everett, a wonderful speaker, but he too, as like me, loved John Paul so much, he wrote a wonderful book. The book is called John Paul II, His Five Loves. I recommend it. But I'm just going to read you a short excerpt from that. Between 5 and 10:30 a.m., and sometimes as early as 4, Pope John Paul II would arise each morning, keeping virtually the same schedule he had as the Bishop of Krakow. Though he enjoyed watching the sunrise, the main reason for his early start was to make time for prayer. He prayed the rosary prostrate on the floor or kneeling, followed by his personal prayers, and would then go to the chapel in order to prepare for the 7:30 Mass. According to his press secretary, his 60 to 90 minutes of private prayer before Mass were the best part of his day. At the chapel, he would kneel before the Blessed Sacrament in his prie-dieu. On the top of his wooden kneeler could be opened, and it was brimming with notes from people that had given it to him, seeking his prayers for all kinds of petitions, including healings, the conversion of family members, or successful pregnancies. Perhaps 30 to 40 new petitions were given to him each and every day, and he would pray specifically over every one. He said that they were kept there and were always present in my consciousness, even if they cannot be literally repeated every day. After going to the sacristy to don his vestments for Mass, he would again kneel or sit for 10 to 20 minutes. When visitors arrived to join him for Mass, they would always find him kneeling in prayer. Some said he looked like he was speaking with the invisible. One of the masters of ceremonies added, "It seemed as if the Pope were not present among us." Bishop Andrew, who was ordained to the diaconate by Pope John Paul II, added, "You could see that he was physically there, but one could sense that he was immersed in the love of the Lord." They were united in talking to each other. During the celebration of the Eucharist, one observer noticed he lingered lovingly over every syllable that recalled the Last Supper, as if the words were new to him. Then, after the moment of consecration, he would genuflect before Christ's presence on the altar with tremendous reverence. Visitors to his private masses noticed that you could hear the thud of his knees slamming down on the marble floor when he became too weak to support himself as he genuflected. After Mass, a lengthy time of thanksgiving followed before the Holy Father greeted guests and gave each of them a rosary. The Eucharist was the principal reason for his priesthood. He said, "For me, the Mass constitutes the center of my life and my everyday." He added, "Nothing means more to me or gives me greater joy than to celebrate Mass each day and to serve God's people in the church." St. John Paul II didn't merely offer the Mass, he lived it. Like the Eucharist itself, he became an immolation of love, a living sacrifice offered to the Father for the salvation of mankind. Because of his deep faith in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, he was adamant with priests and bishops about how the Mass ought to be celebrated. He told a group of American bishops, "This is why it's so important that liturgical law be respected. The priest, who is the servant of the liturgy, not its inventor or producer, has a particular responsibility in this regard, lest he empty the liturgy of its true meaning or obscure its sacred character." As we look at the person of John Paul II, I think he, probably more than anyone in our modern times, is a very symbol of what it means to be holy, to be a saint. You could see it in his life. You could see it in his every moment. This was the busiest man in the world. You think you're busy? You think you've got a lot on your plate? I dare you to say that to John Paul II. This man only had time to pray just one short hour before his work began. And yet, that prayer was the best moment of his life. The center of who and what he was. So I ask the question, do you want to be holy? And when I say to you want to be holy, I don't mean in some vague, esoteric sense. I want you to keep the vision of John Paul II in front of your eyes and say, do you want to be holy? Because I think in his visage, in looking at him, that we get in our modern day exactly what it looks like. Now, perhaps you're not called to the exalted office that he was called to, sure. Perhaps you're not meant to be holy for the entire world to see, that may be. But maybe you are. Maybe the only people you're supposed to be holy for is your family. Maybe you're meant to be the image for them. Will you hold an image as high and as exalted and as beautiful as John Paul II's image? Isn't this exactly what it means to be a Christian? To be another Christ in the world? John Paul shows us what it looks like. So I'm going to ask, if we're supposed to be more like Christ, how? How do we do that? How do you and I become more like Christ? Think in a moment for your head. Think concretely, what can I do right now that will make me more like Christ? Maybe many things pop in your head. Maybe you think about being kind. Maybe you think you should pray all 20 decades of the rosary this week. Maybe you think, I need to start the divine office. Here's my question. Was anyone's first answer, well, I need to spend more time with the Eucharist? Did you give yourself a litany of things that you knew that you're supposed to do? Or did you turn and say, wait a minute, he's actually over there. Maybe I should just go sit with him for a while and maybe he'll rub off on me. Because Jesus himself is physically present, is spiritually present, is divinely present there. So if we're looking to be like him, then maybe like John Paul, we should make him in the Eucharist the center of our life. And yet, you and I, we so easily will allow ourselves to fall into the list of things that I know I'm supposed to do. I remember Martha and Mary, where Martha is sitting there at the feet of the Lord. Mary, got backwards. And Martha says, can't you do something? And our Lord says, she's chosen the better part. To merely sit in my presence and be with me. The Eucharist is Christ. It's him there. So the question is, do we actually act like it? As I was preparing for this talk, I realized I better practice when I preach a little bit. So the very first thing I did is of course, knowing that I'm going to be talking about the Eucharist, it made sense that the logical thing to do would be to go sit in adoration for a while. So I went and I knelt before our Lord, and I knelt before him completely silent for an hour, saying, I don't know what you want me to talk about, but it's your talk, not mine, so whatever you want. And I came home and wrote this in 5 minutes. What do we learn by spending time with Jesus in the Eucharist? What do we learn by spending time in his physical, spiritual, and divine presence here on earth in front of you and I? Well, as I was sitting there, I realized there's a few things we learned. And so I offer this as merely as a reflection, if you were. I think you probably will learn something else. But this is what I learned in that short hour that I spent with the Lord. Now, as I was sitting there, I also brought a bunch of John Paul's writings. And so I'm going to reference everything I learned to John Paul, right? So I'll start with a little thing from him, and then I'll explain what that means. So here we go. The first thing we learn from the Eucharist is trust. From John Paul. This is the wonderful truth, my dear friends. The Word, which became flesh 2,000 years ago, is present today in the Eucharist. And again, it is pleasant to spend time with him, to lie close to his breast like the beloved disciple, and to feel the infinite love present in his heart. How can we not feel a renewed need to spend time in spiritual converse, in silent adoration, in heartfelt love before Christ present in the most holy sacrament? True belief in the Eucharist, well, it's hard. You see, it's not like in the movies where you have the angels singing in the background and there's some light coming from the sky like a Hallmark card landing on the Eucharist, where you have this beautiful, fabulous sign saying what's going on. Truth is, you and I are easily distracted. Even at Mass, I remember not too terribly long, I was sitting there, and as I was kneeling, As the priest was saying the words of consecration, in my heart of hearts, I'm thinking, are you really there? Are you really there? Now, in one sense, we have many symbols that help us along with this. We have adoration, put the Lord in the monstrous to make it see, like a big neon sign. Look, here, there's something going on. And those symbols are powerful, and they're helpful. And we should use them. But we have more than that. We also have the many Eucharistic miracles that have been given to us. And those have been given to you. You know, oftentimes we think miracles happen to other people. But the reality is those miracles are for your edification. So that you can know with certainty that what you're receiving is Christ himself. So learn about the miracles of the Eucharist. I won't go into them today. But those miracles are there so that you know that his presence is truly with you. I want to talk just a little bit about faith here, because for us to really understand how we're meant to engage in that trust, we have to understand what faith is. So when we talk about faith, we use faith a lot like we use love. In other words, I love my dog, I love vanilla ice cream, and I love my wife. And you and I both know that those are three very different things. And we do the same thing with faith. We use the word faith, and we act like that's one meaning, when the reality is there's more than one. Right? For example, I have my faith, the things that I believe. For example, I have faith in Africa. I know Africa's really there. I've never actually been to Africa. I've seen a zebra at a zoo, and I've seen lots of pictures. And people have told me that Africa's there, and I accept it on their authority. Right? And so I have a solid belief, a solid faith in Africa, despite my lack of experience with Africa. And our faith is like that too. I mean, you and I have learned from those who've come before us. They've given us sure knowledge that we can trust. And we might not completely know that knowledge in and of our own heart. We might not even have that experience, but we can trust those who've come before us. But that kind of faith is a noun. But the faith that I'm talking about when we talk about the Eucharist is not a noun. It's a verb. It's an action that we're taking. Let me draw you an analogy. The bishop was talking about the Grand Canyon in his talk this morning. I want you to imagine that you're at the Grand Canyon. Have you ever been there? It's a very big hole in the ground. And I want you to imagine that there's a bridge that goes all the way across. It's huge. It'd have to be able to cross such an expanse. And this bridge is made of glass. Now, it's been engineered by the best engineers in the world. It's been made to be walked on. And you get there and you're looking at the bridge and people are walking across the bridge. You can see them do it. You know your faith in the bridge is sound. You know it's there. You know it's solid. But when you walk up to take that first step and you look down and you see 2,000 feet underneath you, your heart's going to flutter. It's going to take an act of faith, the verb, the action of trust in what it is that you've heard, to be able to take that step and walk forward. In a similar way, you and I know that Jesus is present in the Eucharist. Maybe you haven't felt the full intensity of that experience, but you know he's there. You can trust it solidly as you can trust that bridge, even if it can be hard at times. Don't be upset with yourself because you have palpitations. Don't be upset with yourself because you're worried. Rather, move forward in trust. St. Augustine puts this best. It's faith seeking understanding. That you and I are meant to have faith and act on it. And then we grow to know it. So it's by your devotion to the Eucharist that you begin to understand what the Eucharist is. We also learn from the Eucharist, we learn about humility. Again, Pope John Paul II. Only through the Eucharist is it possible to live the heroic virtues of Christianity. Charity to the point of forgiving one's enemies. Love for those who make us suffer. Chastity in every age and situation of life. Patience in suffering. And when one is shocked by the silence of God in the tragedies of history, or in one's personal existence. You must always be Eucharistic souls, in order to be authentic Christians.